Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talk Speak podcast today. We're going to zero in on a really significant agreement signed back on April 30th, 2025. It's the United States-Ukraine Reconstruction Investment Fund.
Yeah, sometimes called the AJON. And it's more than just another aid package announcement.
Absolutely. This isn't your typical news bite about aid.
No, this dives deep into the mechanics, the long-term vision behind it. It hints at a real shift, potentially, in how the U.S. approaches supporting Ukraine.
So forget the headlines for a moment. We're going to really unpack the details of this fund, look at the potential economic upsides, but also the risks for Ukraine.
And what it signals, for the wider global political and economic scene.
Think of this as your shortcut, really, to getting a handle on a pretty complex but very important development.
And to do that, we've been looking at the agreement text itself, official statements, naturally, expert evaluations, related research.
A whole range of sources.
Exactly.
So our mission today, figure out what this fund actually is, how it's supposed to work, why it matters so much for Ukraine, and, well, what signals it's sending.
And there's some surprising bits, like you mentioned, that link to military aid and this idea of the U.S. getting first choice on resources.
Right. Okay, let's dig in. Where did this start?
Okay, so the setting was Washington, D.C., April 30th, 2025. Signatories were U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Ukraine's first Deputy PM and Economy Minister, Yulia Sviridenko.
And this wasn't just whipped up overnight.
No. Apparently it followed months of pretty intense negotiation. There were even some delays earlier on.
So what's the main goal? What are they trying to achieve?
The core idea is to create, they call it a flagship mechanism. And the aim is to encourage investment, transparent, responsible, looking ahead into key parts of Ukraine's economy to really support their recovery strategy.
So it's not just patching things up from the war.
Exactly. It's framed as being about long-term economic success and also, strengthening that U.S.-Ukraine partnership.
And how is it set up legally? What's the structure?
It's a limited partnership, an LP. It's jointly managed. On the U.S. side, you have the DFC, the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation.
Right.
And for Ukraine, it's their state agency for supporting public-private partnerships.
Okay, so joint management.
Yes, and critically, both entities have the full faith and credit backing of their governments. Meaning their governments guarantee their financial obligations, adds a layer of security, theoretically.
Okay.
Now, it still needs the green light from Ukraine's parliament, the Verkhovna Rada.
Okay.
But the expectation is that it'll only require some limited tweaks to Ukraine's budget rules, not a major legislative overhaul.
Got it. So joint management, who actually makes the decisions? How does the money get allocated?
Well, the governance is interesting. There's a board, 3 representatives from each side.
Yeah.
U.S. and Ukraine.
Equal footing then.
Equal voting rights,
Yep.
50-50 partnership. And all decisions on using the resources, investments, distributions later on have to be made collaboratively.
That sounds crucial.
It was apparently a key point for Ukraine in the talks. Ensures they have a real say, prevents one side from just dictating terms.
Makes sense. Builds trust. Okay, now, the money. Where does it come from? Ukraine's side first.
Right, so Ukraine commits 50%, half of future state budget revenue that comes from newly issued licenses.
New licenses for what?
For mineral projects, oil and gas projects, and related infrastructure. But, and this is really important, revenue from existing big players, like Ukrnafta or Energoatom, is excluded.
So the fund's income depends entirely on these new ventures being successful.
Pretty much. Its profitability hinges on attracting that new investment and making it work. Ukraine can put in additional resources if needed. That option's there.
Okay. And the U.S. contribution, is it just cash?
Not quite. There will be direct financial contributions, yes, but also potentially new forms of assistance. And this is where it gets, innovative.
No one.
They're talking about potentially including things like much-needed air defense systems, but even more striking. Future U.S. military aid, think ammunition, weapons, training, is actually set to be counted as a capital contribution to the fund.
Wait, really? Military aid as an investment in a reconstruction fund?
Exactly. That's a really novel, maybe even controversial framing?
Definitely unconventional. Okay, so if these projects, funded by Ukraine's future revenues and U.S. contributions, including military aid, if they generate profit, what happens then?
For the first 10 years, all profits and income stay in the fund. They get reinvested.
Reinvested where?
Back into new projects or other reconstruction needs within Ukraine. Build momentum. Only after that initial decade will they discuss terms for actually distributing profits.
10-year reinvestment period. Okay. And the practical side, taxes, moving money?
The fund gets tax exemptions in both the U.S. and Ukraine for its income, for contributions, and there's a guarantee for free cross-border capital flow, full currency convertibility, though, acknowledging wartime restrictions might apply. Ukraine also agrees not to use its domestic laws to sidestep its obligations under this agreement. And disputes. They're meant to be resolved through cooperation, negotiation.
Okay, so we've got the structure, the funding sources. What exactly is this fund targeting? Which resources, which sectors?
It's quite specific on minerals. Development of mineral resources, especially critical minerals and rare earths, is a major focus.
Like what specifically?
Well, the text mentions 55 minerals and more can be added, but it highlights things strategically important to the U.S.: titanium, lithium, uranium, graphite, cobalt, nickel.
Key battery and tech metals.
Exactly. And rare earths like lanthanum, cerium, scandium, big list.
And energy.
Yes, new oil and natural gas projects fall under it too.
And infrastructure, is that covered?
Yes, but specifically infrastructure linked to extracting those resources. So construction, processing facilities for the minerals, oil, gas.
And crucially, all located in Ukraine.
Must be in Ukraine and jointly approved by both the U.S. and Ukraine.
Okay, starting to get a clearer picture. Now let's zoom in on some of the really key provisions. What stands out?
Well, first and foremost, it strongly reaffirms Ukraine's sovereignty.
How so?
It states very clearly that Ukraine keeps full ownership and control over all its subsurface resources, infrastructure, natural resources in its territory, its waters. Ukraine decides what gets extracted and where.
And those big state energy companies?
Like Ukrnafta, Energoatom. They remain 100% Ukrainian state-owned. That's explicitly protected. Apparently, this was a big improvement from earlier draft that had raised some concerns.
That sounds like a vital safeguard for Ukraine. Okay, what about all the aid the U.S. has already provided? Billions. Is there anything in here about paying that back?
No, absolutely not. The agreement is explicit. Ukraine is not required to repay any past U.S. aid, including military aid.
Really? Because there were rumors.
There were. Early versions apparently suggested Ukraine might have to repay up to $500 billion, which President Zelensky flatly rejected.
Understandable.
So the final deal only counts future U.S. military aid as contributions to the fund. It's a huge concession, really protects Ukraine's economic sovereignty on that front.
Well, that's a massive difference. Okay, let's go back to that idea of future military aid being treated as contributions. It's still unusual. Why structure it like that?
It is unusual. It's an innovative mechanism, maybe a controversial one too.
In what way?
Well, by calling future military aid a capital contribution, it reframes it. For the U.S., it potentially looks more like an investment with a possible long-term return, which might, make it more palatable domestically.
Political framing.
Potentially. And it directly ties ongoing military support to Ukraine's economic future. But it does raise questions. What kind of aid? Will there be new conditions attached?
Right. It's not just a grant anymore. Okay. And then there's this first choice provision for the U.S. on resources. Explain that.
Okay. So the agreement gives the U.S. government, or buyers they designate, the first right to purchase the natural resources developed under this agreement.
First dibs, basically.
Essentially. The White House rationale is that this prevents key resources from ending up in, quote, the wrong hands. Now, the terms of purchase were supposed to be negotiated based on market-based commercial terms, and Ukraine can't offer better deals to anyone else.
But functionally?
Functionally, it gives the U.S. priority control over these newly developed Ukrainian resources. It's a key mechanism for U.S. strategic resource acquisition, no doubt about it.
So Ukraine owns the ground, but the U.S. gets first option to buy what comes out of it. How does that square with Ukraine wanting to join the EU? Any conflicts there?
They address that. The agreement explicitly states it shouldn't hinder Ukraine's EU accession process. It's meant to be consistent with Ukraine's constitution and international obligations.
Okay, so they tried to build that in.
Yes, that was important to ease concerns from both Kyiv and Brussels, ensuring this bilateral deal doesn't block the bigger European integration goal.
Right. One last key provision area, security guarantees. Ukraine has been asking for those for a long time. Does this agreement deliver anything there?
No. Despite Ukraine's consistent push, this agreement does not contain any explicit, legally binding U.S. security guarantees against future Russian aggression.
So what does it say?
It affirms a long-term strategic alignment, U.S. support for Ukraine's security, prosperity, reconstruction, integration into the global economy. General supportive language.
But no hard commitment, like NATO's Article 5 or similar.
Nothing like that. The idea might be that deeper economic ties, the U.S. having skin in the game, could indirectly increase the U.S.'s incentive to protect its investments. But the agreement itself lacks those firm security commitments Ukraine wanted.
Okay, so lots of potential, some innovative ideas, but also significant challenges and risks, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The biggest, most obvious one is the ongoing war,
Mm.
the security risk.
Yeah.
Private investors. They're just not likely to pour billions into long-term projects, especially mining while shells are flying or there's no lasting peace.
And many resources are in dangerous areas.
Exactly. A lot of potential mineral sites are in currently occupied territory or right on the front lines. Think about 2 of Ukraine's 4 known lithium deposits, for example. Plus, landmines, unexploded ordnance. It's a huge deterrent.
A massive hurdle. What else makes this difficult?
Even if peace breaks out tomorrow, there's the investment climate. Ukraine's made reforms, yes, but investors still worry about regulatory hurdles, complex rules, getting reliable geological data, land acquisition issues.
And corruption.
And potential corruption, yes. The fund has to be squeaky clean, highly transparent and accountable to build any trust.
And the physical damage from the war?
Infrastructure.
Devastating. Ukraine's lost nearly half its power generation capacity. Around 50% of major substations hit. Mineral extraction needs a lot of energy.
So you can't mine without power.
You can't mine efficiently without reliable power and transport. Rebuilding that infrastructure is a massive prerequisite for any serious mining investment.
We talked about Ukraine's potential mineral wealth, but how solid is the data? That's a really critical point. A lot of the assessments rely on old Soviet-era geological surveys,
Not exactly up to modern standards.
often lacking the precision needed today. You need modern mapping to know the depth, the ore type, the grade, what other minerals are mixed in, to really know if it's commercially viable.
So the potential might be overstated or at least uncertain.
The commercially extractable potential is uncertain without more modern work. The EBRD is helping Ukraine digitize old reports, which is good, but new exploration is needed.
And mining itself isn't quick or cheap.
Not at all. Developing a mine typically takes something like 18 years. Investment, $500 million to $1 billion, maybe more.
Wow.
Attracting that kind of long-term, massive private investment in Ukraine's current high-risk environment, extremely challenging.
What about the U.S. side, the DFC? Are they equipped for this?
That's a fair question. The DSC is the U.S. partner managing this. It's a big expansion of their usual scope. In 2024, they only financed 4 critical mineral projects globally.
So this Ukraine fund is a huge step up.
A huge step up in scale and complexity. Do they have the resources, the specific expertise, the risk appetite for this? It remains to be seen. Their success directly impacts whether private money follows.
And finally, politics. These are long-term deals.
Right. Success depends on continued commitment, stable policies in both Washington and Kyiv. A change in government in either country could lead to policy shifts affecting the fund.
Okay, lots of hurdles. Let's step back and look at the bigger economic picture. Ukraine's mineral wealth potential versus reality.
Well, the potential is undoubtedly huge. Ukraine is considered one of Europe's most mineral-rich countries. Maybe 5% of the world's total mineral resources.
Wow.
95 out of 117 mineral types found there have commercial value, including loads of critical minerals the U.S. and EU need.
Give us some key examples again.
A major iron ore exporter already.
Yeah.
Huge manganese, titanium reserves, top 10 globally. Graphite, massive reserves, maybe 20% of global resources. Lithium, potentially one of Europe's largest proven reserves, maybe 500,000 tons proven. Estimates of 33 million tons potential.
Huge numbers.
Uranium, Europe's largest reserves. Rare earths, lanthanum, cerium, neodymium, potentially Europe's largest extractable reserves. Plus nickel, cobalt, chromium, copper, the list goes on. Coal, gas, oil too.
We hear these massive figures sometimes, trillions of dollars worth. How reliable are those?
You see numbers like $15 trillion or SecDev estimating $12.4 trillion just in the occupied territories. But caution is needed.
Why?
Those figures often represent total potential resources, maybe based on that old Soviet data, not necessarily what's economically recoverable right now with current tech and prices.
And the elephant in the room again, occupation.
Exactly. A huge chunk of this wealth, coal, lithium, iron ore, rare earths, is in the east and south, much of it under Russian occupation.
What kind of percentages are we talking about?
Estimates vary, but maybe Russia controls something like 63% of coal deposits, 42% of metals, 33% of rare earths and critical minerals, including lithium, 20% of gas, 11% of oil.
So nearly half the metal resources, key lithium sites.
Are in occupied territory. meaning actual development hinges entirely on Ukraine regaining that territory or some future peace deal.
So, potential huge reality constraint. Now, the needs, Ukraine's reconstruction cost.
Just staggering. The latest joint assessment, World Bank, UN, EU, Ukraine Gov, puts the 10-year need at $524 billion as of end of 2024.
$524 billion. How does that compare to Ukraine's economy?
It's nearly 3 times their projected 2024 nominal GDP, and it's up from the previous estimate of $486 billion. Direct damage alone is estimated at $176 billion.
Which sectors are hit hardest? Where's the money needed most?
Housing is highest, around $84 billion needed. Transportation, $78 billion. Energy and extractive industries, $68 billion, and that's seen a huge jump, 70% increase in damage reported since the last assessment.
Bring figures.
Commerce and industry, over $64 billion. Agriculture, over $55 billion. Even just clearing debris is estimated at nearly $13 billion.
So this U.S. fund, how we're structured, is just one piece of a vast puzzle. Is there a funding gap right now?
A big one. For 2025 priority projects, the government has about $7.4 billion allocated with donor help, but there's still an estimated $9.96 billion funding gap just for this year.
Emphasizes the need for private investment.
Absolutely crucial. Public funds alone won't cover it.
So what impact could this specific U.S. Ukraine fund have, realistically?
The hope is it acts as a catalyst. It uses government guarantees, the lure of resource revenues, to attract billions in private money. DFC's involvement is meant to signal safety, bring in U.S., EU, other allied investment and tech.
Like a seal of approval.
Something like that.
Yeah.
MJAM Ukraine welcomed it, sees it potentially working with existing investors, attracting new ones. The idea is jobs, economic activity, especially in infrastructure, resource development, maybe helping internally displaced people.
Stabilizing finances.
Early recovery efforts could help stabilize national finances.
Yeah.
Reduce reliance on direct aid over time. The focus on energy, infrastructure, mining. That's key for reconstruction, but also long-term competitiveness.
And the critical minerals part is strategic.
Hugely strategic. Developing those could make Ukraine a key part of Western supply chains, as we said. And the agreement emphasizes tech transfer, helping Ukraine modernize. DFC is supposed to help with that.
Okay, but let's be realistic again. Viability, risks.
Right. Reserves aren't profits. Old data needs modern checks. Is the grade high enough? Is it too deep? Too costly? Some Soviet-era viable deposits might not be viable today. Global commodity prices swing wildly, too.
Infrastructure bottlenecks.
Huge ones. Not enough power, damaged transport. You need massive investment just to fix those before you can really ramp up mining.
And the long timelines, high costs we mentioned.
Exactly. Will private investors really commit billions for decades in this environment? Big question mark.
What about people? Labor.
Labor shortages are a top concern for Ukrainian businesses now.
Yeah.
Even more than security in some surveys. Displacement, mobilization. Reconstruction and mining need lots of skilled workers.
And processing. Can Ukraine refine these minerals?
Currently, not enough capacity locally, especially for complex stuff like rare earths. Building refineries, that's more huge investment, tech, time.
Plus environmental standards for export.
Yes. Exporting to places like the EU means meeting strict environmental rules. Could add costs, affect competitiveness.
So summing up the economic viability.
Potential value is immense, yes, but much is occupied. Commercial viability of known reserves is often uncertain. Relying on Soviet data is risky. Need modern exploration.
So the actual fund revenue in the short term might be lower.
Could be much lower than theoretical values suggest. Success will depend on smart choices. Prioritize projects in secure areas with good geology, decent infrastructure, clear market demand. Maybe start smaller, fix infrastructure first, pave the way for bigger resource plays later.
Okay, let's shift now to the geopolitics, the strategic angle. Why did the U.S. do this? What are their interests?
Securing critical mineral supply chains is definitely a core driver.
Yeah.
Reducing dependence on China, especially.
Right, the geopolitical competition.
Exactly. Ukraine's reserves in Europe are a big opportunity for diversification. Titanium, lithium, graphite, rare earths. The fund's priority purchase rights for the U.S. are key here. Supports U.S. defense, tech, clean energy sectors.
Does it fit any particular foreign policy approach?
It aligns pretty well with the transactional diplomacy, the sort of America first thinking. Linking aid to potential returns, getting priority access.
Making allies pay more directly.
That kind of philosophy. Trump called the deal a return on U.S. aid, ensuring the U.S. doesn't look foolish, gets compensated.
Does it give the U.S. more influence over Ukraine?
Deep economic involvement like this certainly gives the U.S. significant influence, leverage over Ukraine's economic future. That skin in the game aims to keep Ukraine aligned with the West, might give the U.S. more sway in future talks, maybe peace negotiations.
Could this become a model for dealing with other countries?
This investment for minerals model, possibly. It could be a template for U.S. engagement with other resource-rich nations facing complex political or security situations. There's talk of similar frameworks being explored, like with the DRC.
How has it affected the direct U.S.-Ukraine relationship?
It definitely deepens the economic partnership, moves it beyond just donor-recipient towards mutual investment, potential shared returns. Both sides called it historic, adds a big economic pillar.
And without those security guarantees, does this economic tie serve another purpose?
For Ukraine especially, yes. It's seen as a form of alternative long-term U.S. commitment. The hope is, if the U.S. has major economic interests, it's less likely to walk away, less likely to cut off military support, maybe some deterrent effect too.
Has it helped ease past tensions? There were rough patches.
Yes. The final deal, particularly the parts favorable to Ukraine for giving past debt, respecting sovereignty, seems to have repaired some strains from aid arguments or Trump administration skepticism. The $50 million weapons sale approved the same day was seen as another positive signal.
But are there potential future problems baked into the deal?
Oh, potentially. How the U.S. uses that priority choice could cause friction. Linking military aid to the fund's performance, what if the fund underperforms? Does aid become uncertain?
Good point.
DFC's performance, efficiency. That could affect cooperation. And if Ukraine's reconstruction or resource development stalls, could lead to U.S. frustration. Seeds of future disagreement are there.
What about the message to Russia?
It's meant as a clear signal. The U.S. is committed long-term to Ukraine's survival, prosperity. Russia's goal of wearing Ukraine down won't work. U.S. economic skin in the game means tangible interest, less likely to abandon Ukraine.
Does it say anything about Russia's role in Reconstruction?
Explicitly excludes them. Any state, company, person supporting Russia's war machine is barred from benefiting from Reconstruction funded by this agreement, tries to prevent Russia profiting from the recovery.
And in the language used, full-scale invasion.
Yes. The consistent use of that phrase in the agreement and U.S. statements is seen by some as a stronger, less ambiguous stance than sometimes heard previously from the Trump administration.
But does it actually deter Russia right now?
Probably limited immediate deterrent effect. Why? No hard security guarantees, as we said, and huge practical obstacles to implementation of the war, damage, investment risks, which Russia can still influence militarily.
How did Russia react?
Officially, mockery. Medvedev said Trump forced Kyiv to pay for aid with minerals, called Ukraine a disappearing country, suggests they don't see it changing the immediate strategic balance.
So symbolic meaning might outweigh immediate impact for now.
Possibly. It signals long-term U.S. intent, but its real deterrent power depends on overcoming the hurdles, making it real, translating potential into reality on the ground.
What about other international reactions? U.S., Ukraine, Europe, Russia?
In the U.S., Trump admin pushed it hard. Historic partnership, lasting peace, securing U.S. interests. Some Democrats were critical, calling it extortion. Leadership generally positive. Zelensky. Truly equal agreement, opening doors for investment, modernization. Others emphasized mutual benefit, sovereignty, debt waiver.
Europe.
UK Foreign Secretary welcomed it, reaffirmed UK support. EU official reactions were more cautious, focused on compatibility with Ukraine's EU integration path.
So overall, a complex geopolitical product.
Definitely. Trying to balance U.S. interests, Ukraine's needs, signal Russia, long-term impact depends on the war, U.S.-EU policy coordination, lots of factors.
Okay, let's broaden out now and compare this U.S. fund approach with what Europe has been doing, aid, peace efforts. How do they stack up?
It's a vital comparison. Since February 2022, the EU and its member states together have become huge aid providers to Ukraine. Overall, their commitments have actually surpassed the U.S. in recent years.
Really? Surpassed the Europe?
In total financial terms, yes. By early 2025, total EU and member state commitments, financial, military, humanitarian, refugee aid were close to $155 billion. With future plans like the Ukraine facility and using frozen Russian assets, total commitments could reach nearly $196 billion.
How does that break down compared to U.S. figures?
Kiel Institute tracks this. As of Feb 2025, they had total European commitments around $138 billion, U.S. around $115 billion. Europe leads significantly in financial and humanitarian aid. military aid commitments were more similar.
So Europe's carrying a heavier load overall, especially financially.
The numbers suggest that yes. Though methodologies differ slightly between sources, the consensus is Europe's total commitment is larger.
How is Europe delivering this aid? What are the main channels?
At the EU level, there's the Ukraine facility, up to $50 billion predictable funding till 2027 for budget support, investment, technical help. The European Peace Facility, EPF, reimburses states for military aid or funds joint procurement over $12 billion committed there.
All right.
Then macrofinancial assistance, MFA loans, big humanitarian aid via ECHO, and coordinating in-kind help through the Civil Protection Mechanism.
And individual countries.
Significant bilateral aid, too. Direct money, weapons, supplies, hosting refugees. Germany's a huge bilateral donor. But if you look at aid as a share of GDP, Nordic and Baltic states contribute relatively more than some larger economies like France or Italy.
Is European military aid changing, like the U.S. approach?
There's a similar shift happening, moving from donating old stock towards joint buying and producing new weapons for Ukraine. And the EU training mission, EUMAM, has trained over 73,000 Ukrainian soldiers.
And the frozen Russian assets. Europe's leading that.
Yes, most frozen Russian central bank assets, over $210 billion, are in Europe. The EU agreed to use the profits from these assets to help Ukraine. First payment went out mid-2024, more planned. They'll also use these profits to back loans under the G7's ERA initiative.
Okay, so massive aid. What about Europe's diplomatic efforts for peace?
Europe's very active diplomatically, too, with the stance generally emphasizing principles, multilateralism.
What's the official EU line?
Consistent support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity within recognized borders. Any peace must be comprehensive, just, lasting, based on the UN Charter, international law. They strongly back Zelensky's peace formula, participate in summits.
Any core principles for negotiations?
Yes, the European Council laid them out clearly in March 2025. Key ones are no negotiations on Ukraine without Ukraine. Also, no negotiations on European security without Europe's involvement.
Important red lines.
Definitely. Also, any ceasefire must lead to a full peace deal. That deal needs strong security guarantees for Ukraine. And peace must respect Ukraine's sovereignty and integrity.
So the strategy is?
Peace through strength. Keep strengthening Ukraine militarily, financially, politically to improve its negotiating hand, ultimately achieve peace. More weapons, more training, more pressure on Russia via sanctions.
And security guarantees. Europe's willing to offer those.
The EU and member states say they're willing to contribute, especially supporting Ukraine's self-defense capabilities. With uncertainty around the U.S. stance on talks, European leaders stress the need for Europe to provide security commitments.
Do they have experience in mediating this conflict?
Well, France and Germany led the Normandy format talks after 2014 with Russia and Ukraine, led to the Minsk agreements for Donbass. That ultimately failed because Russia blocked it and invaded, but it was a European-led dialogue platform.
Okay, so comparing the U.S. fund approach and Europe's approach, big differences. Complementary, potential friction.
Significant differences in emphasis, yes.
Yeah.
U.S. fund, bilateral, transactional, linking aid to potential economic returns from resources, clear U.S. strategic interest in those resources, long-term economic alignment as commitment.
In Europe.
Europe, more multilateral framework focus, EU, international cooperation, support based on principles, law, rights, democracy, broader aid scope grants, budget support, humanitarian, refugees, promoting reforms for EU integration, more legal institutional tools, linking aid to reforms.
How does this difference play out in peace approaches?
Europe's peace stance is rooted in international law, multilateralism, Ukraine's sovereignty. Insists on inclusive frameworks like the peace formula. That contrasts with the U.S. fund's transactional focus on bilateral interests, resource access.
Could that cause coordination problems?
Potentially. The EU's insistence on no talks without Ukraine and no talks on European security without Europe shows concern about being sidelined in U.S.-led talks that might prioritize speed over principles.
And the different ways aid is structured, U.S. military aid as investment versus European grants.
Right. U.S. transforms future military aid into fund investment. Europe provides huge amounts of non-repayable aid, budget support, humanitarian help stuff, with no direct economic return for donors. Kiel data showing Europe's larger total commitment supports this.
Suggests a division of labor.
An implicit one, perhaps. Europe covers more immediate non-recoverable costs, government functions, relief, refugees. U.S. structures its security aid for potential long-term economic gain via resources, a shift in burden sharing.
But they both want to help Ukraine contain Russia.
Broadly aligned goals, yes. U.S. fund investments could complement European reconstruction. EU reforms could improve the environment for U.S. investment. But coordination is vital.
To avoid what?
Conflicting aims, wasted resources. Example, ensuring U.S. resource plans meet EU environmental standards and Ukraine's sustainable goals. Transatlantic communication on peace talks is even more critical to stay unified, avoid being divided by Russia.
The clause in the U.S. deal about not hindering EU accession helps.
It's a positive sign, yes, but ongoing coordination in practice will still be absolutely necessary.
So wrapping up the comparison.
European aid is large-scale, broad, principles on peace. U.S. fund is transactional, resource-focused, different models, different strengths, different weaknesses, potential synergy, potential friction. Success depends heavily on U.S.-Europe coordination.
Okay, so bringing this all together for our listeners, the U.S. Ukraine Reconstruction Investment Fund. It's a major agreement, complex, potential to help Ukraine recover, potential to serve U.S. strategic interests and resources.
But facing huge challenges, the war, obviously, attracting private money into that high-risk environment.
While European aid offers a broader, more multilateral approach, focused on principles and wider support.
Exactly. And those unique aspects of the U.S. deal, military aid as investment, U.S. priority access to resources, they're innovative, maybe controversial, definitely worth watching.
And at the end of the day, the success of this fund, Ukraine's whole recovery, it really hinges on fundamental things.
Achieving a lasting peace, absolutely.
Yeah.
And sustained, coordinated commitment from both the U.S. and European allies.
We hope this deep dive has given you a more nuanced perspective than the quick headlines offer, a better grasp of the complexities involved. Now, a final thought for you to consider, something to mull over. Given these differing approaches we've discussed between the U.S. and Europe, what do you think is the most critical factor for Ukraine's long-term stability and economic prosperity? Is it securing that large-scale private investment? Is it receiving comprehensive multilateral aid? Or is it achieving those firm, reliable security guarantees against future aggression?
A tough but crucial question.
Thank you for joining us. See you next time.